This is an excerpt from a paper that I gave at a conference about 5 years ago. And the section is just entitled Kierkegaard's Treatment of the Arguments for the Existence of God. I got this from the section that we're considering today of the Philosophical Fragments. And in this particular excerpt, Kierkegaard quickly runs through 5 objections to the arguments for the existence of God. Now, to structure this, I drew pretty heavily on Charles J. Kelly's Essential Thinking in Kierkegaard's Critique of Proofs for the Existence of God, The Journal of Religion, Volume 59, Number 2, April 1979, pages 133 through 153. I'll try to read this slowly. There's going to be a lot of material here, but I think it's better to include it rather than exclude it. Plus, I worked really hard on this, and someone should benefit from it. All right, here we go. So the 5 objections. Objection 1. Demonstrations are either impossible or foolish. So let's look at this argument. 1, we call the unknown that collides with man's reason the God. 2, if the God does not exist, it would be impossible to prove the God's existence. 3, it would be folly to try and prove that God exists if he does exist, for I would not attempt to prove God's existence unless I was already assured of his existence. In effect, this means one would be proving something that is already known, which is foolish. Therefore, the idea that the existence of the unknown, the God, could be demonstrated does not suggest itself to reason. So, this is my analysis of that first objection. So, if God does not exist, and we attempt to prove him, we are wasting our time. Conversely, we would not try to prove God unless we were already assured of his existence, and proving something that is already known is a foolish endeavor. It seems right that it would be impossible to prove God's existence if he is in fact non-existent. So no protest will be made of that claim. However, premise 3 seems to be wrong on at least 2 counts. First, it could easily be contended that we attempt to prove things that we do know all the time. In fact, one could reason that the whole enterprise of proving things is to cultivate knowledge of the thing being proved. Second, it is not obvious that proving things already known is a foolish exercise. Here are some reasons that proving something known, such as God, might not be foolish. 1, we may owe it to others to convey what we know, and proving something such as God might be the only way to do so in a convincing manner. 2, we may need to prove God to ourselves, even if we think we know him, as a means to reinvigorate our conviction. Just as scientists run multiple tests to prove a theory, we might need to come to knowledge of God via varied means in order to have firm knowledge of him. 3, proving God might be an essential philosophical exercise that we have to work out before progressing to other theological, ethical, and political matters. Maybe if we thought about it like this, the geometer might be trying to prove something new and bold, but before he can reach his final conclusion, he has to show his work. He has to include the simple proofs leading up to his innovative discovery. And 4, perhaps proving God encourages contemplation of the divine and brings us closer to what we already know. Perhaps it is a means for reintroducing us to knowledge that we may have taken for granted. For all these reasons, and many more, it does not seem foolish to prove something that we already know. So as long as God's existence hasn't been disproved, all the proofs ought to be considered by those open to the possibility of a God. Objection 2. Proofs for the existence of God are misnamed. Okay, so 1. When we argue that God is in possession of all perfections and existence is a perfection, therefore God must exist, we have made a deceptive move. 2. The following dichotomy gets set up. Either the Supreme Being was non-existent in the premises and came to be in the conclusion, or he was existent in the premises, meaning that he cannot come into existence in the conclusion. 3. It is impossible for the necessary Supreme Being to be derived or come into existence in the conclusion. So the Supreme Being cannot be dependent on an argument for existence. 4. So the first disjunct has been ruled out. 5. In the second disjunct, we do not prove God since he is already existent in the premises. God's existence has already been assumed. The best we can do is logically develop the content of the God, such as determining his necessary existence. 6. Therefore, one cannot prove existence. Rather, we can merely develop a conception's content. Now, I have some footnotes here from Kelly, page 139, the Philosophical Fragments, page 49, and Kierkegaard's Concluding Unscientific Postscript, page 298. So, the analysis of objection 2. Much of the response to this argument has to begin with the claim made in premise 2. The argument seems to only work if the dichotomy Kierkegaard establishes is a meaningful one. Let's examine the first option. Either the Supreme Being was non-existent in the premises and came to be in the conclusion. Kierkegaard flatly denies this possibility, for it would give the proof the power of producing a necessary being when the conclusion is reached. This is colorful rhetoric, but we need to back it up here. If one really did conjure up a proof, not knowing God existed when laying out the initial premises, but then concluded that God must exist, must we then conclude that God's existence was contingent upon those premises? This is absurd. God, if he is truly God, is totally unaffected by our attempts to prove him. If there is a God, he existed prior to proofs. He would exist should we err and conclude that he does not exist. And God would exist while we are formulating the principles that eventually allow us to conclude that he does exist. I'm not sure where this line of thought comes from. If we prove that some physical object exists, i.e. a subatomic particle, do we think that thing comes into existence once we've proved it? Of course not. It was there all along. But maybe this is a disanalogous case. Maybe Kierkegaard had something else in mind. When we prove that a certain geometric form or number exists, do we think of that thing as always existing? If I prove through geometry that a dodecahedron exists, yet it is not naturally occurring, could it be said that the proof produced the object in the conclusion? It seems like this might be a possibility. The only way to get around this would be to claim that not only God, but also numbers and geometric figures have a necessary form of existence and exist in a sense prior to proving them. It is my understanding that this is a subject matter still up for debate by philosophers and mathematicians. So 3 scenarios seem likely. 1. Proving God is akin to proving that some physical object exists. Therefore, it is safe to say that God existed prior to the demonstration of the proof. 2. Proving God is akin to proving a geometric figure. Therefore, God exists prior to the proof as long as numbers and figures exist eternally as well. 3. Proving God is akin to proving a geometric figure, and because numbers and figures do not exist eternally, then God does not exist prior to the completion of the proof. There may be a 4th scenario yet to be considered. God is not a physical object, however his existence precedes proof, whereas other non-physical objects, i.e. geometric figures, are produced by proofs. It seems the only way Kierkegaard's second objection can work is if in the articulation of the second premise of the argument, Kierkegaard had scenario 3 in mind, i.e. proving God is akin to proving a geometric figure, and because numbers and figures do not exist eternally, then God does not exist prior to the completion of the proof. If we can determine that this scenario is incoherent, then the proofs are not misnamed, and there's the very real possibility that if they work, they do prove something. It appears that scenario 3 can be ruled out if we have successfully defended the ontological argument. Numbers and geometric figures are not perfect. Therefore, we don't have to attribute the quality of existence to them as we would to God, being that he is the most perfect thing. Note, see the discussion of the ontological proof handled by Kant. Elaborate if necessary. Well, I guess we'll have to take that up one day. The second disjunct of the premise of premise 2 has already been addressed in the analysis of objection 1. Merely because God exists when the premises of an argument are articulated does not follow that we do not prove him. God can exist before we reach our conclusion. He does not have to be assumed in the premises of the argument to prove him. To reiterate, God can simultaneously exist and we can prove him without assuming him, therefore making it possible to prove God rather than merely developing a concept. Neither part of the disjunct in premise 2 is viable, therefore Kierkegaard's second objection is unfounded. Objection 3. Existence is never subject to demonstration. 1. We reason from existence, not toward existence, regardless of whether we are in the realm of sense perception or within the realm of speculative thought. 2. We do not prove that a stone exists. Rather, we prove that some existing thing is a stone. 3. In courts of law, we do not prove that a criminal exists. Rather, we prove that the accused is in fact a criminal. For proving God's existence is analogous to these examples. Therefore, God's existence cannot be demonstrated. So, analysis of objection 3. Claiming that we reason solely from existence and not toward existence seems wrong-headed. This can be demonstrated using Kierkegaard's own analogies. Analogy 1. True, no one would take it upon themselves to prove that a stone exists, but rather that the particular thing is a stone. One may point to qualities X, Y, and Z to prove the stone's stoneness. This is not the case with all physical objects, though, and again I'll resurrect the example of a subatomic particle. Calculations may prove that some undiscovered subatomic particle must exist. The entity in question will then be searched for, and then once found, tests will be run to see if it is in fact the entity proved by calculation. This seems to be an example of an object proved, where we reason towards existence. The only way Kierkegaard could beat this objection would be to claim that when calculations lead us to postulate a certain entity, that this is not in fact a proof. This, however, seems to be a very narrow definition of what constitutes a proof. Analogy 2. For the most part, the analogy Kierkegaard gives in premise 3 appears to be true. Once we are in court, it is taken for granted that a crime has been committed, and it is just a matter of proving whether or not the individual in question is the criminal. Yet things are not always so simple. Say, for instance, that a man is being tried for arson. A prosecutor may have successfully pinpointed the defendant at the scene of the crime and that he had tanks of gasoline in his car and a motive for doing all of this. The defense could easily contend that all of these things could be true, but that the prosecution has yet to prove that a crime occurred. The defendant may have had the intention to do these things, but a fire broke out, coincidentally before he had a chance to set the place ablaze. The prosecution would then have to go back and prove that a crime and therefore a criminal exists. This would have to be done first before the man on trial could be convicted as said criminal. So it appears that existence can be demonstrated in both the sensible realm and the court of law, and if the analogies hold, then God's existence is in theory demonstrable as well. Objection 4. Demonstrations rest on an ideal interpretation of the world. 1. Napoleon, the individual, can be seen as the explanation of the French victory at Austerlitz. 2. But there is no need to posit Napoleon as the individual from the event. 3. It could just have easily been some other military genius. 4. Thus, it appears that we cannot deduce the existence of something based upon effects. 5. However, might the case be different with God? God's acts are so uniquely his that we can identify God by his acts. 6. Therefore, God is the only being whose essence includes existence. 7. But this is problematic, for the deeds of God are not immediately known. 8. We have two options. A. We can interpret the world in theologically loaded ways, i.e. the world exhibits intelligent design. Or B. We can merely intimate that the world exhibits some order, leaving it wide open to whether or not a God exists at all. 9. If we go with A, we are not proving God. We have already assumed the existence of God and are developing the ideality of the Supreme Being. 10. If we go with B, we cannot reason from effects to particular causes. 11. Therefore, God's existence cannot be proved via effects, either because doing so requires idealized interpretations that ultimately rest on the presumption of a divine being, or the effects are so minimally described that it is impossible to deduce anything as particular as a God as a cause of them. So I got this from Kelly's article, pages 146 through 147, Kierkegaard's Philosophical Fragments 50 through 53, and, oh, look at this, a Whitaker article that I'll have to go back and find the citation for, pages 119 through 122 and 125. So, the analysis of objection 4. This proof has many steps, so we'll have to break off chunks at a time. Our attention should be trained on steps 1 through 4 initially. Kierkegaard uses a victory in a battle to illustrate that we are not necessarily entitled to attribute the victory to a specific person, such as Napoleon. In reality, probably a plurality of causes brought about the victory, and to deduce a single cause from the effect is most likely a mistake. This seems like a fair assessment, especially when we are dealing with events that are likely brought about by a multitude of forces. But can the same be said when there aren't as many causal forces involved? Say we discover Napoleon's clothes laid out on his bed. Would we be allowed that Napoleon picked out his attire for the day? Would we be allowed to conclude that Napoleon picked out his attire for the day? We may, but we may also be able to conclude that Josephine picked out the pants and a servant laid out his hat. So it seems that in everyday life, regardless of the magnitude of the effect, we aren't allowed to strictly infer a cause from effects. I'm not sure if the same holds when we are working on the physical level. The whole enterprise of science is based on the validity of induction. It would appear at this level certain effects would allow us to infer certain causes. However, this is not a settled question within the literature. For our purposes, it might be enough to point out that in some instances it is possible to properly infer a cause from effect. This is an important distinction, but it is unclear if the caveat could ever lead us to conclude that an agent, be it a person or God, brought about a set of affairs. Moving on. The supposed two-horned problem that comes along with postulating that only God produces certain effects needs to be explored. Let's look at the first horn. If we hold that God has recognizable effects, then we will be interpreting the world in a theologically loaded way, which ultimately requires us to assume God rather than to prove him. This appears to have some merit to it. A theistic scientist will look at the orderliness of data, interpret it as a confirmation of an already held belief that there is a God who organizes the universe in an orderly fashion. An atheistic scientist will look at the same data and will not be led to conclude there's a God behind it all, orchestrating everything. Most likely they will chalk up the results to order brought about by physical law. So the unique effects move doesn't really work. If it did, it ought to lead to universal assent about the divine amongst scientists, and we know very well that this consensus is lacking. Positing unique effects reveals one's starting assumption, which is God, the very thing you are trying to prove. Now, the second horn of the dilemma occurs when we do not theologically load the data of the world. If we merely point to the orderliness of the world, it is not obvious that a God is even needed to bring the world about. God may have been the cause of it. One could point to physical law as a candidate as well, or even a multitude of gods working together, taking a cue from Hume. Even if the world is described in this minimal way, I wondered if it is enough to have us rule out any cause but a monotheistic God. I'm sure there are more alternatives than I have posed here, but let's consider the candidates of physical law or a multitude of gods as those things which bring the orderliness to the universe. In the case of physical law, could we not then ask what a law is and how it determines the orderliness? If we think physical laws exist prior to the orderliness of the universe, admittedly a very strange idea, could we not ask what accounts for those physical laws, leading us to decide between a single God and a plurality of gods? From there, would we have good reasons for thinking a single God brought about the uniform laws, or are there equally compelling reasons for why a multitude of gods are responsible for the laws? This would undoubtedly require much more research to resolve. Just at first glance, if I posit there must be one God that accounts for physical law, I'm assuming that only a single dictate and fashion can fashion any seamless orderliness in the world. It doesn't seem so hard to imagine that a group of gods could work together in order to achieve the same laws and minimal amount of orderliness. We might be stuck with these two options. So, on the surface of things, it appears that this objection, Kierkegaard's, rightly plagues what would be known as the physic-theological argument. From what we've considered thus far, the ontological argument and the cosmological arguments given Kierkegaard's analysis still are viable. If either of them could establish a sole God, then that might resuscitate the physico-theological argument for a single God. Both together either could help us decide between monotheism or polytheism. Okay, last one. Objection 5. The existence of God emerges from the demonstration by a leap. 1. The proofs for the existence of a God yield very little and go on ad infinitum. 2. If we desire to demonstrate God, we must abandon proofs. 3. God's existence emerges when we posit his transcendence. 4. Therefore, God's existence emerges not via proof, but by a leap. So, I got this from Kelly, page 148 and 150, and Kierkegaard's Philosophical Fragments, page 53. So, analysis of objection 5. Given the foregoing analysis, the first premise in the argument has been called into question. Though we have not defended a convincing rational proof for God here, we have opened up the possibility that such a proof would reveal more than the assumption or the foolishness of the philosopher maintaining it. So it is possible, at least within Kierkegaardian thought, for a rational proof to yield something of value and to be settled once and for all. This insight, however, does not change the complexion of the rest of the argument for Kierkegaard's fifth objection. God may, in fact, emerge by taking a leap of faith. Let's think on that for a second. A considerable discussion of this idea will have to occur in the next chapter, which you guys aren't getting, for that is where we consider Kierkegaard's thinking of the right way we are to relate to God and within which religious framework. A very, very brief adumbration of his ideas can be sketched here in order to provide a glimpse of that discussion. Essentially, Kierkegaard believes that attempts to arrive at objective knowledge of God through means such as rational argumentation are not only failed from the get-go, but they are actually counterproductive in the following sense. The only way we come to have knowledge of God is through a subjective relationship with the divine, and as long as we are obsessed with objective methods, that knowledge will never come about. I think there are at least two issues that we will need to raise here, keep in the back of our minds, and bring up again when the time is right. First, if God's existence emerges when we take the leap of faith, how do we know with certainty that this thing we are experiencing is some kind of knowledge of God? How do we eschew away the criticism that it is some sort of psychological after effect? Or does it even matter as long as it brings about fulfillment and happiness? Second, how is this argument convincing to anyone who is truly interested in knowing God? On the surface, it seems that we are asked to give up intellectual means of knowing God and practice a different form of understanding. The argument made in this fifth objection appears not to be an argument made to everyone. It is hard to imagine a principled atheist or agnostic shrugging their shoulders, uttering, "Why not?" and taking the leap of faith. The argument appears to only have any validity for intellectual believers not content with the simplistic faith they were brought up with, who have exhausted all the objective measures of proving God. Conclusion. Our survey of Kierkegaard's critiques of God have led to at least the following major conclusions. 1. The ontological and cosmological arguments are still a viable means for proving God, though, as we mentioned earlier, given Kant's analysis of the cosmological argument, truly only the ontological argument proves the God we have in mind. 2. We have even greater reasons to suspect that the teleological argument is capable of proving after Kierkegaard's analysis. We have even greater reasons to suspect what the teleological argument is capable of proving after Kierkegaard's analysis. And 3, it is highly questionable if knowledge of God is really gained through a leap. Knowledge of something may be attained, but the abandonment of proofs calls into question whether or not this knowledge really deals with God. Kierkegaard could claim that there is another form of knowledge, a non-speculative form of knowledge not considered here. All right. Okay. I hope you all found this helpful on some level. Thank you.